Hello everyone, Just Podcast TV is here. Please don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notified on new contents.
When Franklin saw that his prestige was still unable to suppress the workers, he immediately shouted, "Are you going to rebel?" But this time, James pulled Franklin aside and said to him, "Franklin, don't worry about it. Let them continue to cause trouble." "But sir," Franklin hesitated for a moment, but when he saw James's determined look, he stopped talking. In total, there were actually 20 to 30 workers in the entire hall who stood up against James, the new boss, and protested against him. Looking at this scene, Franklin, Lucas, and Edward all frowned. This situation wasn't good. If this continued, it would cause a big commotion and maybe even attract the police. However, even while facing such a situation, James still had a relaxed look on his face, as if this wasn't a big deal at all. Everything was well within his grasp. "Anything else?" James asked with a grin as he looked at the workers who didn't stand out to oppose him. His smile had a bit of charm, which made those workers who opposed him immediately have a bad feeling. However, as soon as his voice fell, the entire company hall was so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. In the end, no one else stood out to oppose James. James saw this, which indicated that the remaining people were willing to obey the punishment of 100 push-ups. So he waved his hand and said to Franklin, "Tell them that they don't have to come to work tomorrow." Franklin looked at James in shock. He couldn't even speak. Although he could see that the new boss was tough, he didn't expect him to be so tough on him. He had fired so many senior employees in the company because of a disagreement. He didn't know whether this method was ignorant or cruel. These upper management employees were the foundation of the company. James needed to be very cautious. How could he be so hasty? However, before he could continue thinking about how to persuade his new boss not to be so rash, James's expression changed and he shouted at Franklin, not giving him any time to think at all. "What? Did you not hear me clearly?" To James, what he wanted was absolute control of the company, not to compromise with everyone. The people beneath him only needed to carry out his orders and didn't need to have their own thoughts. Perhaps someone would say, "Are you nuts? Don't tell me you have so much money that you can't spend it all. You want to destroy your own company?" But James really did have so much money that he couldn't spend it all. Although the company was valued at $82 billion, to him that was nothing. He absolutely didn't want this company. Franklin instantly understood his mistake and quickly nodded his head in agreement. Only then did James nod his head and say, "Go on, I'll leave this matter to you." "Yes, sir," Franklin answered respectfully. He finally understood that this was the new boss's test of his ability. "You want to fire us?" However, before Franklin could start using his authority given to him by James, Calvin laughed. James looked at Calvin calmly. He said, "You're right. To be precise, that is what I mean." Calvin didn't get angry after hearing what James said. Instead, he laughed and said, "Buddy, I think you're crazy. Do you know how important we are to the company? In other words, although we're just employees of the company, we're the cornerstone of the entire operation. You'll never be able to imagine how much power we have. It's not an exaggeration to say that if you let us leave today, there will be a huge problem with the operations of your company tomorrow because of the lack of employees. Then it will gradually lead to bankruptcy. Do you believe that?" After Calvin said this, the other people who had stood out to oppose James also echoed him. "Yeah, that's right. Don't you know how to manage anyone? Don't tell me you want to destroy your own company. This is the most idiotic boss I have ever seen. How could this damn company be bought over by a stupid person like you? What bad luck." At this moment, none of them seemed to realize that they were going to be fired. In their opinion, real businessmen only cared about their interests. As long as he wasn't that stupid, he wouldn't do that. They really had nothing to fear. "Get out of here," James yelled. Everyone was stunned on the spot. Calvin was instantly rendered speechless by James's words, but then he laughed and said, "Good, you can do it. You really can. Come on, let's go. Tomorrow there will be people crying and begging us to come back. After Calvin spoke, he waved his hand and led the group of people out. It seemed that not only were they not sad about being fired by James, but they were also chatting and laughing with each other. They thought that when the new boss found out about the problems with firing them tomorrow, he'd beg them to come back. But before they walked out of the hall, James pointed at the staff who had chosen to stay and said loudly, "Everyone here, is there anyone among you who is qualified to take over Calvin's position?" James was the most familiar with the complicated interpersonal relationships in a company. He deeply understood that as long as he was willing to promote someone, the company would definitely have talent. In this world, there was always a lack of good jobs, and there would not be a lack of talented people who could do good jobs. No company would be an exception. There was no one in a company that couldn't be replaced. As expected, as soon as James finished speaking, a man in his 20s stepped forward and said, "Sir, I'm willing to give it a try." The man's name was Holt, and he was in the same department as Calvin. He was Calvin's deputy, and he was extremely capable. However, with Calvin around, it would be very difficult for him to display his talent. However, now that the opportunity had come, how could he let it pass him by? Not only that, but this man was also very smart. After saying he was willing to give it a try, he immediately got down on the ground and started doing push-ups. James was very happy. He immediately said, "Good, very good. From today on, Calvin's previous position will be yours. I'll add another $200,000 to your annual salary. I believe you'll definitely do a better job." In fact, James didn't even know what Calvin's former position was, but that wasn't important. What was important was his attitude. As long as he was obedient under James, everything else wasn't important. Calvin, who hadn't yet left the hall, heard James's words and froze on the spot, as if he'd been struck by lightning.
Hallo Nederland, Taco Fashion is online en 24 uur per dag beschikbaar. Shop exclusieve online collecties, meer kleuren, maten en feel-good stijlen wanneer je ze nodig hebt. Ga naar taco.com en laat alles naar je winkel of direct bij je thuis bezorgen. Veel plezier met online shoppen.
With Holt successfully taking the lead, many of the workers who hadn't stood up to oppose James immediately scrambled to volunteer and recommend themselves. "Sir, I'm from the Human Resources Department. I think I can take on Chris's job." "Sir, I'm from the Marketing Department. I think I can take on Jack's job." "Sir, I'm from the Logistics Department. I feel like I can take on Winston's job." Before James could say yes to them, they started doing push-ups very seriously, expressing their commitment. James smiled when he saw this. He knew very well that this was the human heart. As much as they worked hard to do push-ups now, it showed how hard they would work in their respective jobs in the future. This was also what James wanted. He wanted absolute control over them. No matter how good a company was, it would be like a pile of loose sand if the employees weren't united. It would definitely be a company with strong ability to resist risks and crises. Everyone could use their strengths and move forward together. No matter how big the crisis is, it can be easily overcome. On the other hand, if a company was in disarray, if they encountered any difficulties, they would collapse or even go bankrupt. Although James didn't lack money, and as the company's owner, he still had to manage the entire company well. Therefore, James was very happy to see this. It proved that the first step of his management of the company had been very successful. Franklin laughed because he felt there was a huge problem and the new boss had solved it with just a few words. This new boss wasn't messing around. On the contrary, he was a master at playing with people's minds. This time, his heart was filled with joy. As for Edward, he didn't need to say anything. The way he looked at James was already full of worship. Although he was the owner of a bar and was also in charge of some employees, he felt that compared to James, his management methods were simply a joke. Good. It's rare that everyone is so enthusiastic. James looked at the workers who had recommended themselves and said, "Franklin, count all of the people who are willing to improve themselves. As long as you meet the standards, Your salary will increase by $200,000. Everyone, work hard. I have never lacked money, and I'll definitely not treat anyone disrespectfully who is willing to sincerely work for me. As soon as these words were spoken, the entire hall was instantly filled with applause and cheers. It was at this moment that everyone understood that this new boss wasn't some poor man, but a truly wealthy tycoon. His clothing was only to test the people with elitist views. Everyone immediately laid on the ground and started to do push-ups, including Lucas and Miguel. Of course, Calvin, who had already walked to the entrance of the hall, and the group of workers who had stood out to oppose James, were excluded. Calvin and the workers who had left on their own accord and thought that James would cry and beg them to come back were all stunned. Their bodies were stiff, and they couldn't move. They had originally thought that during this confrontation between the employees and the boss would definitely be the one who would lose in the end. However, they didn't expect to lose before they had even started. James calculated very accurately. Their annual salaries were actually very rare in London, but now they had lost their jobs because of their arrogance. This was a fatal blow to the society that was hard to find a job in. At this moment, more than 20 workers understood that as long as they stepped out of the door of this hall today, they would not have any relationship with the Excalibur Company anymore. But they were already incompatible with the new boss. If they turned around and talked about it, they would lose all of their dignity. In this kind of situation where it was difficult to advance or retreat on both sides, they finally understood the true meaning of power. They were in a dilemma where they couldn't back down. Now the entire hall was filled with two completely different kinds of vibes. On James's side, the push-ups were in full swing by the workers who had stayed behind, and that atmosphere was lively. Even though they were all exhausted and sweating profusely, they didn't feel much pain because they saw hope. And the more than 20 people led by Calvin, who were preparing to leave due to so-called human rights, were currently in a heavy mood, and the atmosphere was suppressed to the extreme. The entire hall was like two different worlds of ice and fire, appearing so unique and distinct. Finally, under strong psychological pressure and the temptation of a high salary, there was finally one person on Calvin's side who chose to throw away his dignity and walk towards James while trembling with fear. He walked in front of James and respectfully gave him a nod. Then he said, "Sir, I'm sorry I was convinced by Calvin just now. That's why I stood up to oppose you, but now I realize my mistake. Can you give me another chance to work for you?" In the face of money and benefits, he had to compromise. The reason was simple. Those illusory personalities and dignity couldn't pay his bills, and it would only make his situation worse. However, James looked at him and smiled without saying anything. With him leading the way, the rest of the people also turned around and walked back because they realized the seriousness of their problems. James wasn't saying it, but he really wanted to fire them. Compared to the food and clothing of the family in the capital they had to continue living in London, dignity was nothing. They walked in front of James and admitted their mistakes, hoping that James would give them another chance. Even Calvin, who stood out first, stood in front of James with a respectful face. He showed the most pious expression he'd ever shown in his life and expressed his apology. He hoped that James wouldn't fire him. After all, his annual salary was $800,000. Now that James had raised his salary had reached $1 million. This salary was too tempting. He didn't have the courage to leave. The turn of events was so big and time passed so fast that everyone in the hall couldn't believe it. No one would have thought that such a situation would happen. So for a moment, everyone's eyes were focused on Calvin and the workers who had opposed James and wanted to leave. James looked at Calvin and the group of workers and couldn't help but laugh out loud. After laughing, he continued, "Oh, you want to come back, but do you think you can come back to my company as you wish? James's words instantly made Calvin's face and neck turn red, but he had nothing to say. It could only silently bear it. I remember someone saying that I'll cry and kneel and beg you to come back tomorrow, but I don't think I've cried and knelt yet, James continued. As soon as he finished speaking, the workers who had stayed behind suddenly laughed mockingly. James's words were like a loud slap in the face to Calvin and the more than 20 workers who had opposed James, but they couldn't refute him at all. It wasn't that James didn't have a good heart, but he'd never show mercy to those who didn't know what he was capable of. Although Calvin and the others were willing to admit their mistakes, their fate of being fired would not change. Let's go. From now on, you're no longer my company's employees because you're not qualified. My company does not need employees like you, James said decisively. James wasn't interested in slapping the faces of these insignificant people. He didn't want to waste his time. Life was short, and he still had many things to do. Seeing James's firm attitude, Calvin no longer cared about his dignity. He kneeled in front of James and begged, "Sir, I was wrong. I was so wrong. Please give me another chance. I have an 80-year-old mother and 3 children to raise. I really need this job. I beg you." When the others saw that Calvin was so shameless, they also knelt down and begged James to give them another chance. They promised they'd work hard. However, James had already made up his mind and wasn't moved at all. It was true that the management of the company needed to be humane, but when it was time to be firm, he'd definitely not be lenient. Therefore, James waved his hand and said, "Lucas, I'll leave it to you. Clean this up for me. Tell them not to affect my work." "Yes, sir." Lucas immediately gathered the security personnel who had finally recovered. He pulled Calvin and the others and walked out of the company's lobby. However, Calvin was furious when he saw James being so unreasonable. He said to James, "Sir, wait. It's not legal for you to fire your employees like this. We signed the labor protection law when we first entered the company, and we also signed a 5-year employment contract. It's illegal for you to dismiss us like this. Think about this carefully." Calvin's request was useless. James still insisted on what he did and still wanted to fire them. In the end, his evil side was revealed. Then James looked at him and smiled. "Is that so? Then you can just go to the relevant departments and report me. It's okay. Do you want me to have a driver to take you there?" Calvin was an arrogant person, but now he was rendered speechless by James's words. He'd never seen such a person before. When he said he wanted to report him, he wasn't worried at all. Instead, he asked if he wanted a driver. This was arrogant and overbearing. This was simply displaying the word arrogant to the extreme. However, if you think this is the end, just wait. After James finished speaking, he turned his head and said to Franklin, "Franklin, I'll have to trouble you with one more thing. Investigate all their accounts in the company. According to the contract, how much compensation should be paid for breach of contract? It should be 3 times the compensation. But if there is a problem..." James sneered and stopped talking. He just quietly looked at Calvin. Calvin's expression changed instantly. His attitude took a 180-degree turn. Before Franklin could say anything, he quickly said, "What? I'm sorry, I misspoke just now. If there's nothing else, I'll be leaving." Because his previous job was to take charge of the market, he'd gotten a lot of benefits from that position. If they really wanted to investigate, he'd be held responsible. Without saying anything else, Calvin left dejectedly, making those workers who originally wanted to fight James lose their backbones in an instant. So once Calvin left, the group of people instantly scattered like birds. Once they left, the entire hall instantly became quiet. After everyone had finished doing their push-ups, James gave everyone a speech to unite and rally the workers. After making some arrangements, he let Franklin bring him into his CEO office. Because the office of Excalibur was located in the most prosperous Oxford business district, there were no skyscrapers here. Although it was on the top floor, James looked out and it was only about 10 stories tall. Fortunately, since the buildings were not that tall, His field of vision was very good. He could see the scenery on both sides of the River Thames. There were also two very beautiful female assistants in the office. They had blonde hair, blue eyes, long legs, and slim waists. Their figures were excellent and very pleasing to look at. After enjoying the cruise ship and all kinds of charming British buildings with Edward for a while, James lay on the luxurious and spacious sofa and drank the coffee brought by an assistant. I wonder how those 4 women are getting along now. Did Cindy get bullied by Vanessa? James drank his coffee as he muttered. He was really worried about those women now, but he didn't want to go back and face them because that feeling of being stuck in the middle of a dilemma was too uncomfortable. James was thinking about the problem. Edward sat quietly on the sofa opposite him. At this time, a beautiful female assistant walked over and gently said, "Sir, let me top off your coffee for you." It was his personal assistant, Amy. James looked up and saw her gentle smile and sexy figure. The worries in his heart immediately lessened a little. "Okay," he nodded at Amy, but he found that his eyes couldn't move away, so he just admired her without any restraint. Because it would be a waste not to look. Now that the 4 women weren't around, he'd like to admire her a bit more. Otherwise, when those women came, he wouldn't have the chance to look at her like this anymore. Amy was very embarrassed by James's gaze, but after all, she lived in London, so she naturally wouldn't be as shy as other women. So she quickly adjusted her position and added coffee to James's cup. She looked at the other assistant, who also had a sexy figure and was extremely beautiful, and smiled. Then she gently asked James, "Sir, Jessica and I have good massage techniques. I see that you look tired. Do you want us to help you relax?" James was lying there listlessly, but when he heard this, he instantly became energetic, and all the blood in his body started to simmer. Jessica also smiled and walked towards him. That attitude, that smile, that kind of gentleness. James dared say that as long as a man was a man, he'd definitely not be able to resist it. Seeing this unfold, Edward almost choked on his coffee, so he quickly said, "Mr. Tucker, I just remembered that I have an important phone call to make. I'll go do that now." With that, Edward got up and left James's office. He didn't really have a phone call to make, but this didn't seem to be appropriate for him. If he stayed, it would only make him feel more awkward. However, he was really envious of James now. Why was he so popular with women everywhere he went?